President Joe Biden publicly doubted the death toll in Gaza during a speech earlier this week, saying he has no confidence in the numbers that are coming out of Palestine. Let's watch.
Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war. I think we should be incredibly careful. I think not we, the Israelis should be incredibly careful to be sure that they're focusing on going after the folks that are propagating this war against Israel. And it's against their interest when that doesn't happen. But I have no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using. Palestinians are telling.
Biden snapped at a USA Today White House correspondent in a joint press conference he held yesterday at the White House with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. The reporter tried to sneak in an extra question, which Biden didn't seem to take kindly to. Let's watch.
But aren't these hostages in jeopardy if there is a ground invasion?
You want to make a speech? No, look, obviously they're in jeopardy. The question is whether or not there's any way of getting them out.
Biden's remark came after the reporter, Joey Garrison, asked two questions regarding the Israel-Hamas war, including the response to the threat from Iran, which Biden said he told the Ayatollah the U.S. will respond to any aggression. So I think there's also been some news, some speculation that there will be an effort to kind of smoke out Hamas out of tunnels using some kind of gas. And the question has been whether, one, that is something that is actually being planned for, and two, if that's the case, if that is basically an admission that the IDF is not prioritizing actually getting those hostages back.
The hostages back, yeah, which should be the major goal. Still Americans being held. When questions are asked of John Kirby and other people, it's not clear what kind of priority this is being given or what kind of pressure Biden is actually exerting on the Israeli government.
Right. Now, the first clip has gone mega viral precisely because there does seem to be a disconnect between how credulous the State Department, the Biden administration, the U.S. government as a whole has been when believing certain facts and figures that are coming out of Israel versus what's coming out of Palestine. And apparently there has been a pattern and practice over decades of American history that shows that prior to a bombing campaigns, whether they are in Vietnam or Cambodia and other parts of the world, have been preceded by language where there is a downplaying of how many victims are, how many casualties among civilians are being totaled by Americans. That enables, of course, them to act with impunity. So Biden saying in that moment, kind of pivoting from talking about the growing death tolls now that they've gone up above 6,000 for dead civilian Palestinians, suddenly saying, well, we're not going to trust the death tolls anymore, is a problem for folks. Specifically, the Washington Post wrote a piece explaining why the death tolls coming out of Gaza have historically been accurate and historically been credited. For one, they say everyone uses the figures from the Gaza Health Ministry because those are generally proven to be reliable. That's from Omar Shakir, Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch. He says, in the times in which we have done our own verification of numbers for particular strikes, I'm not aware of any time which there's been some major discrepancy. But there is this obvious implication here from Biden that because the numbers are coming out of Gaza, that they cannot be trusted.
Yeah, look, no one should be downplaying the horrors, obviously the horrors of the initial terrorist attack, and then also the horrors of civilian deaths being perpetrated against innocent Palestinian people. I mean, it's true that no one can automatically trust what the Gaza Health Ministry that is Hamas-controlled is saying, but also you should certainly take with a grain of salt and not innately trust what IDF sources or American sources say about casualty estimates or what's happened in certain in certain circumstances. Like we've gone back and forth with the hospital situation, with who's responsible, with what the evidence shows, with how many casualties there could possibly be. A lot of this remains genuinely unclear, and if people are right to be skeptical of narratives on all sides of this conflict.
I think the problem is that a lot of it is very clear because there's so much film and video of just tragically so many deceased, named and identified Palestinians. Most recently, I think part of this, the reason why this is so aggravating and unnerving to people who are invested in the rights and well-being of Palestinians, is that this comes one day after the news that we covered that Anthony Blinken had reached out to the Qatari government asking them to basically suppress Al Jazeera Arabic and downplay, I forget the exact words that were used, but to basically minimize the news coming out of Gaza, where they're doing the most on-the-ground coverage, because it was considered to be too incendiary. Not because it's inaccurate, but because apparently the reality on the ground, they believe, is going to provoke people to anger. And then within 24 hours of that news coming out, the bureau chief, the Al Jazeera bureau chief, who was reporting on this, who had sent his family per the IDF's instructions to southern Gaza, where they were supposed to be safe, were killed. His wife and children were killed in a bombing that some people are arguing is targeted, because there is this history of Israel killing journalists. There's been, I think, 20 journalists over the last 10 years or so. So for all of that to be happening, to literally see this bureau chief cradling his dead children and his wife, and to see the picture of, let's say, Justin Amash's second cousin being lifted from the rubble, and then for the President of the United States to say, well, we're not really sure what's really going on the ground. We're disputing claims of deaths in Gaza, I think really struck people the wrong way.
Right. I mean, there's nothing to dispute. There are horrific casualties. We've seen pictures of dead, innocent people, and they're really horrified. I mean, everyone should be careful about what they're looking at. I saw the other day Representative Ilhan Omar was retweeting images that were claimed to be of dead Palestinians that were actually years old from a Syrian earthquake. So she was corrected by Community Notes, which is one of the only useful fixers of misinformation problems on social media. So everyone should be, very careful and double check and triple check and acknowledge the extent of the unknown. But there's nothing to deny that innocent people are dying by the thousands.
Yeah, I mean, one last thing I think that is troubling is that there is just a different sentiment coming from the podium, the mouthpieces of the American government. I think it was actually the Russia UN United Nations account put together a supercut showing how differently John Kirby, National Defense spokesperson, talked about Ukrainian casualties versus Palestinian casualties, and how the messages coming out of the United States with one conflict seems to be attacks on civilians are egregious, attacks on water supplies and foods are war crimes. This is absolutely unforgivable. But when talking about Palestinians, the message is, well, this has just got to happen. Bad things are going to happen. Everybody tighten your belt, buckle up, because you're in for a hard ride. If we can play that, I think it'll be instructive as well.
This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly, and it's going to be messy. And innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different. I wish that wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen. And that doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it dismissible. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to still express concerns about that and do everything we can to help the Israelis do everything they can to minimize it. But that's unfortunately the nature of conflict. This is what she's doing in Ukraine, and think that any ethical, moral individual could justify that. It's difficult to look at the It's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that. So I can't talk to his psychology, but I think we can all speak to his depravity.
When Putin does it, it's depraved. No serious moral leader could ever do such a thing. When Israel does it, it's got to be done.
Well, right. I mean, I think his position is probably that, not that I'm agreeing with it, but that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine the victim, and Israel is the victim and Hamas the aggressor, and these are casualties in the course of Israel trying to rid out Hamas. I think, frankly, most people would accept that some, like he says, some loss of innocent life is going to happen during a retaliatory effort to take out a terrorist group. The question becomes, when is it way too much and you're actually making yourself worse off because you've killed way more people than were even innocent people that even died in the initial attack you're responding to? And when does it become the case where now you're just immiserating, the survivors are going to be so worse off and angry and vengeful, and you're going to and that's going to just grow. That's what I'm worried about, growing more terrorism, 10 or 15 years from now among the survivors who will end up hating what the Israeli government has done to them and what the U.S. government has done in support of that. So that's something we should keep in mind.
Yeah, especially since the Israeli military has admitted that it didn't predict this attack, it didn't see it coming, that the Hamas is largely underground and not vulnerable to the air bombardments that have at this point eliminated more than 40% of all residential housing in Gaza. It's also important to continually note that this conflict did not begin on October 7th, that much like there's this debate in the Ukraine context of how the State Department loves to say this is an unprovoked war without wanting to have any conversation about how we got to this place in Ukraine. Similarly, there is a real reluctance to have a conversation about the fact that the a priori condition here was 2.3 million people being kept in an open-air prison and Palestinians across the region being treated to apartheid conditions, and that's according to 18 humanitarian organizations, including Israeli humanitarian organizations. And what you do, the fundamental problem, some people think, is rooting out Hamas, which Israel's actions, it admittedly, is not gearing them toward doing. Hamas is not going to be gone even if they raise every building in Gaza to the ground. And the a priori condition for people who are invested in the interest and well-being of Palestinians is, how do you end the occupation? That is the thing that needs to be stopped if you want the cycle of violence to end. It is. I cannot stop thinking about the fact that Osama bin Laden's manifesto, in which he argued that the civilians in the Twin Towers were justified targets, echoes so closely what we're hearing out of Israel and the justification of killing all of the civilians in Gaza. And when you talk about the cycle of violence, that is what's ringing so loudly in my head. Do we really want to be using the Osama bin Laden logic for why it's okay to bombard Gaza?
No, we don't. I mean, again, we just played clips of civilian deaths being bemoaned, not saying they're equally guilty and all should die. So I'm not sure the equivalency with bin Laden, but I agree with you that should not be the policy. I mean, you bring up the Russia example. Yes, and we've talked on the show, and we should talk about the bad policies, including of the U.S., that led to Russia making the decision to invade Ukraine, but that doesn't justify or make okay what Russia has done, which is cause a humanitarian crisis and resulted in tons of people. So we can talk about the policies that maybe ought to have been different and wish we could have been different that would have prevented this from happening. And similarly, we should do that in the Israeli-Palestinian context without saying that, in my view, that at all justifies or makes okay or makes tactically smart the killing of random
When you see Kirby crying
civilians
at the idea of the destruction that's happening in Ukraine, crying at the podium, versus him kind of affirming repeatedly that Palestinians just have to die, because that's part of what it means for Israel to defend itself. That doesn't strike you as a kind of clear illustration of the different value of civilian loss?
I don't think the Palestinian civilian loss is being taken seriously enough. It ought to be taken more seriously.
Yeah, it's pretty striking. And I think you're seeing consequences for Joe Biden. I just saw it reported that his approval ratings are lower than they have been historically at 37%. There's been an 11-point drop since this crisis started. So
well, the U.S. getting tangled in another overseas war will not be something that boosts those poll numbers, I will predict, but we'll see.
Yeah, and not just any overseas war, but the U.S. being seen as contributing to the enormous loss of civilian life that's happening so front and center because of social media and independent news. People are seeing it. People are seeing when this Al Jazeera bureau chief is standing there holding his child walking down the street. People are aware of this, and the images aren't going to stop. The images of the tragic events on October 7th have stopped because it was that one singular event. And I think in the media war.
Well, the fear of the Israeli forces is that would not be the end. If Hamas is allowed to continue to operate, there will be more October 7th.
Yeah, that is the fear. But that's not what's happening. What we're seeing in terms of the images that are coming out all over the news is every day the death toll of Palestinian civilians goes up hundreds more. 2 days ago, we were talking about 5,000 dead. Now we're talking about 7,000 dead. So I'm just saying that the reality is the media, from the media sphere, I think Americans are not just turned off by the abstract idea of us getting into another war. They're very much turned off by the idea that American dollars and quite literally American manufactured weaponry is being used to kill the children that they're seeing on their television screens.
Well, you let us know, and we'll have more Rising right after this.